Hi everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar. We're just going to give it a minute or so for everyone to come through from the waiting room and then we'll begin. Hi everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar. It's great to have you all on the line. Our webinar is Superpower Showdown with Bob Davis and Lingling Wei from the Wall Street Journal. Before I hand over to Lisa Bertelsen, who is Executive Director of Public Affairs at the China-Britain Business Council, I've just got a quick bit of housekeeping to run through first. So please note this session is being recorded and a link will be made available to members after the session. If you have any questions for our speakers, please do use the Q&A button on your screens, and then we'll try and bring in those questions in the second half of the session. I'd now like to hand over to Lisa, who will open the session.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. It's a great pleasure to have you with us this afternoon at this webinar where we're looking at how and why have US relations sunk so low and where are they headed? And we're absolutely delighted that we've got Bob Davis and Lingling Wei from the Wall Street Journal who are going to answer these or seek to answer these questions by sharing insights from their new book, which is entitled Superpower Showdown, available at all good bookstores now. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation between my colleague Andrew People and Bob and Lingling, and then we'll open to questions. I'm sure you have all read about Bob and Lingling, but just to cover it again, Bob is a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal. He covers economic issues out of Washington, D.C., and not least those that will play a part in the presidential campaign. But he continues to write about China, where he was posted from 2011 to 2014. And he is actually part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for coverage of Asian and Russian financial crises. Lingling is equally an award-winning journalist, again at Wall Street Journal. She was at the Wall Street Journal Beijing Bureau, currently now in New York. Chinese national, grew up in China, but came of age as a journalist in New York, and then returned to China to the Wall Street Journal's Beijing office in 2011 to report on changes in her homeland. And she focuses on the intersection of Chinese politics with the economy. Now, in the book, based between those two capitals, Bob and Lingling conducted a lot of interviews with government officials, business leaders in both nations, over the past 9 years. So that's enabled them to synthesize and probe how we've reached this extraordinary tipping point in US-China relationship and what it means for the future. Now I'm going to hand over to our advocacy director, Andrew People. But before I do so, just a reminder, as Isabel mentioned, there is a Q&A button down below. Please ask questions. We really do want questions on this one. There is also the excitement of a raise the hand function. So you can raise your hand, metaphorically anyway, and you will be unmuted when we get to the Q&A section itself. So please do ask questions. I know that Bob and Lingling would love to hear your questions. So handing over now, Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for that introduction. It's a huge pleasure for me to be able to speak to Lingling and Bob. I worked, as many of you probably know, I worked for many years at Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal myself, including stints in Beijing and Hong Kong. And I worked a lot with Lingling over the years, not so much with Bob, unfortunately, but it's absolutely fantastic for me to see that their reporting, which was always such leading reporting on this issue coming to fruition in this book, which I have a copy of here, Superpower Showdown, as Lisa said, available in all good bookshops. No, as I say, it's a real privilege for me to be able to speak to both of them and see this book come to publication. We always knew at the Wall Street Journal, when Bob and Lingling had a story in the works, we always knew it was going to be a big one. It was going to be important. It was going to take us forward in where US-China relations had got to, where the trade war had got to, what the thinking was on both sides, from inside the White House and inside Zhongnanhai. And it was a great privilege to work with them. So thank you, both of you, for joining us today. I know you're extremely busy at the moment with the publication of the book and talking to various people about it. So thank you so much for your time. Just before we get into the book, can you tell us a little bit more about how the two of you got to work together? What was it that got the two of you working on stories initially, and how did your sort of working relationship develop? Maybe Lingling, if you fire away on that first.
Oh, sure. I started to work with Bob in early 2011 when both of us, Bob was posted in Beijing office, and I also just relocated back to China at the time. So we started working together back then. And, Bob is really a legend at the journal and, in American journalism. So, we are neighbors. We were neighbors as well. We sat right next to each other. So really got to work with him. Started was, a lot of stories about the behind the scenes look at China's economic policy making. So Bob really helped me look at the big picture, right? Think of stories in a big way. We really, since then we started to develop this huge trust, between ourselves. And then about 4 years later, 3 to 4 years later, Bob went back to DC and continued to cover international economics, including China. And, I remained in China to continue to focus on Chinese politics and economy, the intersection between those two. We kept the relationship going. We kept writing stories together. And then the trade war broke out. We found ourselves actually in a great position to tell this story from both capitals.
Yeah, and Bob, both of you have sort of family connections, family interests in this story. Can you maybe explain the background? Your father was sort of involved in a business that was quite heavily affected by the opening up of the US to China, wasn't it?
Yes, no, definitely. And let me just say, I mean, working with Lingling has been one of the great working relationships of my career. She is just amazingly sourced, amazingly energetic, just a great reporter. It's been really terrific. So yeah, I mean, I think our family's histories do reflect U.S.-China to an amazing degree. So my father used to make luggage in Brooklyn when New York City had a garment industry. He made soft-sided luggage, less expensive luggage, did pretty well in the 50s and 60s when the U.S. was building the interstate highway system. There were more traveling salesmen going all over the place. They needed their suits, freshly pressed. And my father made a suit bag that was one of the early ones on the market. But what he didn't expect and didn't respond well to was competition from Asia. At that point, it was Korea, it wasn't China. It was kind of the late 60s, early 70s. And, in retrospect, it's kind of funny because he worked in a poor area of Brooklyn. So basically working third world laborers with antiquated machinery, and just never figured that people in Asia from, very poor countries in Asia could possibly compete with American know-how. But even high tariffs weren't enough to protect that industry, which ultimately all went to China, all went to Asia, and basically bankrupted my family. But my father wasn't a bitter kind of person. He didn't look at it that way, and ultimately went to work for a company that did importing from Asia, and he wound up traveling a little bit to Korea.
And Lingling, you're obviously Chinese by background, and in fact, your grandfather was on the Long March with Chairman Mao. Is that right?
Yes, he was basically a medic to Chairman Mao during the Long March, and spent about 13 years with him until after the founding of the People's Republic of China. So it's kind of a family roots. My family takes great pride in, like, being connected to modern China's revolutionary history. But I grew up in an environment, China was just starting to grow, to open up to the rest of the world. So unlike Bob's family, I loved what Bob said, previously. Essentially, later on, he realized he was covering trade, something that actually bankrupted his family. In my case, I have benefited tremendously from China's rise and China's integration with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
I got to study at New York University and find a job, the Wall Street Journal, and then going back to China, practice independent journalism. That was, for the longest time, I was a beneficiary from a close relationship between China and the US. But, I wrote an essay for the journal about this experience, but now I've sort of become the collateral damage of the trade, of the bilateral tensions. Now I'm back. I was expelled from China along with other American journalists working for the Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. That was the biggest expulsion of American journalists in recent Chinese history. Never happened before. But we're still, as you know, Andrew, in the Journal, still very much committed to covering China. We understand the hurdles are much higher now, but we just have to work smarter and harder to get the coverage going.
So a deep personal interest for both of you in this story. Obviously, the meat of the book is the current, the recent history, the trade war that's begun, particularly since President Trump came to office. But you spend quite a lot of the time at the start of the book going through the history of the US-China relationship, going back to the 1990s and the entry of China into the WTO and the negotiations around that, the Bill Clinton administration and Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin obviously in charge in China at that time. Why did you think it was so important to take us back to that period to explain the background?
Well, I mean, on the Clinton part, a little bit of it is personal, some of it, some of it made a better story. But I happen to, I've been around long enough that I actually happen to have covered the US-China negotiations over the China WTO accession. Bill Clinton sent Zhu Rongji, the Chinese premier, back home without a deal. I was the one with another reporter, Helene Cooper, now at the New York Times, who broke the story that Clinton never intended to cut a deal, even though Zhu had come expecting one. But I think the other reason, the more important reason really was, if you think about Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, in one sense, it couldn't be, less similar, right? I mean, one was an amazing policy wonk. The other one cares nothing, frankly, about policy. One was kind of first in his class in any academic setting. The other one is pretty clearly not a scholar, shall we say. But think about their similarities. They were both new to foreign affairs when they were elected. They both ran on very populist platforms. Bill Clinton is known as the great globalizer, but that's not the way he ran. He ran on taking on Japan, which was the big issue, and pushing China over a different issue, was human rights at that point. And I think he was really quite serious about it. He appointed a former China ambassador to China, Winston Lord, who was appalled at what China had done at Tiananmen Square. They made every effort to get the Chinese to ease up on dissidents and allow more individual freedom, and they failed miserably. And the reason that they failed, well, two reasons. One was just enormous pressure from the US business community, which at that time was, Beijing's best lobbyist. When Bill Clinton's envoy, Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State at the time, went to Beijing to talk to Li Peng, who was the hardline premier at the time and had been one of the architects of the Tiananmen Square killings. He was there to press him on human rights. And Li Peng said to him, listen, Gold Sachs, as he called it, meaning Goldman Sachs, had already been in there, and told him not to worry because they were lobbying. And so you had a very recalcitrant China. You had a business community that was 1,000,000% behind China. And you also had a business-friendly administration. It was a Democratic administration filled with the likes of Robert Rubin, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and that was sympathetic to that look. And now if you fast forward all the way to the Trump administration, there's a different issue. It was trade, but they pushed a very tough agenda. And one of the biggest changes was the US business community wasn't nearly as supportive of Beijing as it was in the past.
When do you sense, obviously you've been covering this for such a long time now, and when do you sense that sentiment started to turn in the US? As you say, back in the 90s, it was seen as, there was a lot of consensus that this was a good move, opening up to China, bringing it into the WTO and the global system. And then Trump has come along, but Trump didn't sort of appear in a vacuum. At some point, the atmospherics changed in the US. When do you date that turn in sentiment to?
Well, I think from the worker point of view, it's probably always anti-China or worried about China. But I think both of us, Lingling and I, both think that the 2008, 2009 global financial crisis was a real turning point. In one sense, it was the high point of relations between the two nations within a month of Lehman Brothers going broke. The president at the time, George W. Bush, called the Chinese leader Hu Jintao twice, once to get him to show up at what would be the first meeting of the group of 20 leaders ever, and they were going to address the financial crisis, and Hu immediately agreed. And then both countries had enormous stimulus plans, which wound up boosting the global economy and helped pulling the economy out of a recession, which, let's remember, was a made in USA problem. So on one hand, it's, never worked more closely. But on the other hand, the stimulus led to enormous overproduction in China. A lot of those commodities were shipped to the US. They undercut factory town after factory town, deepening the resentment of the US workers. Politicians clearly pick up on that. And the business community, and from the Chinese perspective, they were no longer felt they needed to follow the US model, which had clearly failed. And the US complaints, the US business community complaints about China being closed much more than they thought, pressuring the Chinese government, pressuring them to hand over technology, were building and building. So I think that's a very significant turning point.
Lingling, is that your sense as well, that 2008-9 was a big turning point in China as well, in terms of how they saw themselves, how they saw the success of their economic model, how they saw their relationship with the Americans, with the US?
Yes, absolutely. As Bob said, how the sentiment started to shift in the U.S. Back in China, the Chinese, the global financial crisis just made the Chinese more confident in their system, right? It actually worked. The U.S. was in trouble, and China came to the rescue. So that's basically the narrative back then. And another turning point that really in this bilateral relationship would be late 2012 when President Xi Jinping came to power. Donald Trump really campaigned to make America great again, but President Xi Jinping had his China Dream slogan 4 years before Trump had, put forward his policy agenda. So as soon as he took office, President Xi made it very clear that he wanted to reclaim China's status, global status, and that means China has to become strong economically, technologically, militarily, and geopolitically, so that inevitably just put Beijing on a collision course with Trump administration that also is becoming more focused on domestic agendas and the Make America Great Again, that kind of policy initiative. So that's another basically big turning point. So of course, if you look at Xi Jinping's background, many people emphasize, especially at the beginning, many people, myself included, we only look at his years of running Zhejiang, Fujian, Shanghai, all very developed areas in China, very market oriented. So we thought, he would basically really push ahead with market reforms, deepen market reforms that, a lot of those reforms were stalled during the Hu Jintao era.
Yeah.
So, but we failed to realize that, he's ultimately a party person. His belief in the party really grew over the years, even back during the Cultural Revolution, when he had to spend 7 years basically in a village feeding pigs and do all the manual labor. And that didn't sour his view on the party. That taught him the cutthroat nature of party politics. It also strengthened his belief that all the sacrifices his father's generation, his generation made should never go to the waste. So even that experience didn't sour him, and his experience in Zhejiang and coastal regions, yes, they helped him develop respect for market forces, but he never really saw a contradiction between fostering market forces and the need to adhere to the party rule. So that really helped explain why we're seeing so many contradictions in China's policymaking these days. They still keep talking about reforms, right? Never a day goes by they don't talk about reform. They still talk about it, but in today's China, reform really doesn't mean the kind of reforms we saw during the Deng Xiaoping era or Zhu Rongji era. And also part of the reason because the bar for reform has gotten much higher. Even back during the Zhu Rongji era, he talked about, grabbing the big SOEs, but let go the smaller SOEs. So right now, you really see the sector, all the big strategic sectors are dominated by big SOEs. So it's really much harder now to really push forward those reforms without hurting the party's core interests.
Yeah.
So that's the way you see a lot of contradictions in policymaking in China these days. But whenever that happens, you just always, we should always think about what really the top leader, the leadership sees, it's in the party's interest. I guess that's becoming a guiding principle for us to really try to understand what's going on in China.
Yeah, fascinating. So contradictions within the Chinese leadership and even within Xi Jinping himself. But Bob, could you talk us through what happened, obviously, with the arrival of Trump on the political scene 2016 through the presidential campaign? He was obviously quite hostile towards China on the campaign trail. But then in his sort of first year of office, not too much happened in a sense, or in terms of negative action towards towards China. Can you explain, you have this concept in the book of there being a sort of Wall Street Trump and a blue collar Trump. Can you explain the sort of contradictions that were going on within Trump's own mind and within the Trump administration itself?
Sure. So yes, during the 2016 campaign, he was took a very hard line on China, said China had been ripping off the U.S., but didn't only blame Beijing, blamed the lame leaders, in his view, that had lame U.S. leaders that had allowed this to happen. I mean, it was one of the main talking points of the campaign. It was specifically about China, but it was also a question of fairness and elitism. You know, he was presenting himself as the champion of the people, basically, and this is one of the ways in which he could demonstrate it. And also, if you look back at Trump's career, he has always talked about, how would you say this, about Asia, let's say, as a problem. Before it was Japan, exactly the same rhetoric, you know, playing us for saps, you know, your leaders are morons, you know, you need somebody like myself, you know, to take over the negotiations. And China, you know, after Japan faded in the U.S. concern, China became the target. And he also, during the campaign, to the degree he had policy, he was going to put on 45% tariffs on everything, which even he didn't actually do, but still, you know, very, very tough. Then he gets into office, and that isn't remotely their objective. When it came to Asia, their main objective was North Korea and dealing with North Korea. On trade issues, it was I would say picking fights, but you know, pushing mainly Europe on steel. I mean, the plan in people like Steve Bannon's mind, the nationalist advisor and campaign director, and also Peter Navarro, very, very hawkish campaign advisor. Their idea was, okay, we're going to start off, we're going to beat up the Europeans on steel, show that we're tough, renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement to our liking so that companies that wanted to relocate from China would have a place they could relocate if they couldn't come to the US, and then we'll take on China. I mean, all of that was just a fantasy. It was, you know, they did take on Europe over steel, but they certainly didn't, you know, settle it anytime soon. It's still going on. But again, when it came to Asia, the idea was try to cut a deal with North Korea. China was very important to them. And it got to the point where when the US announced its Section 301 report, which is the report in which the US lays out all its complaints about China, mainly about intellectual property and pressure on US companies. When it got to that point, you know, they were going to have a big ceremony in the White House, inviting a lot of business people, make a big deal about it. It was at the same time when the UN was voting on sanctions on North Korea, and China was actually helpful to the US. So Trump says to his folks, well, okay, let's go ahead with this, you know, this report, but let's not mention China. And they say to him, well, the report is about China. I mean, that's right. The whole point of it.
Yeah.
And he says, well, can we go easy on it? And at that point, early on, China was mentioned a dozen times in the speech. And by the time it came out, there was just one mention of China. It was also during a moment when Trump was under great criticism for his handling of the white nationalist riots in Charlottesville. And so it got almost no attention in the White House.
But then something changes going through 2018 and obviously into 2019. What changed? How did blue collar Trump, as it were, take over? Because all this time, the stock market is going up and up and up, and you know,
right.
the Wall Street Trump seems to be winning out, or at least that side of the administration.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, just to make it clear, I mean, there are two parts to the guy. I mean, he listens, he watches obsessively the way markets go up and down, cares a lot about it, but there is also the blue collar side to him. I mean, part of when he talks about China as a cheater and your, you know, blue collar people getting screwed, I mean, he actually means it. So it goes back and forth. So one of the big things that changed was the appointment or the confirmation by the Senate of Robert Lighthizer as the trade representative.
Right.
He had come he wanted the job largely to take on China. He'd been talking about China for years. He was a steel industry trade lawyer who had sued Chinese companies and gotten rich off of it. For many years, he had made policy recommendations against China. He had written op-eds years before that against China joining the WTO. He had a long history of it, and he's a really smart trade lawyer. So he had put together, this Section 301 report very carefully and convinced the White House to go ahead with it. As I said, it was not much of a launch, but at that time, so you had Lighthizer pushing for it. Also, North Korea faded as an issue. The administration, the national security people in the administration became convinced that Xi Jinping wasn't really all that helpful on North Korea, and to the degree he would be helpful on North Korea was independent of whatever was happening on trade. The question was putting pressure on North Korea in China's interest. If it was in China's interest, they would act. If China felt it was in their interest, they would act, regardless of what was happening on trade. So by 2018, the U.S. is ready to take on China, and invites in Xi Jinping's representative Liu He to D.C.
So, Lingling, while this backward and forward is going on within the Trump administration on how to deal with China and whether to take China on and so forth, what's happening in Zhongnanhai? How are they thinking about the Trump administration? Is it fair to say they were too complacent maybe about Trump in the first instance? Did they underestimate him? Or were they trying to work out how to take on this guy and how serious he really was?
Right, it's a fair description of the sentiment initially, at least in China. So I think the biggest mistake the Chinese side made was they underestimated the changing attitude in Washington about China, just as Bob described. The whole campaign rhetoric, right, accusing China of having raped the US economy, all that kind of rhetoric, the Chinese side has been used to that. During every presidential election, all the presidential candidates would just basically single out China as this punching bag. So even the Chinese public has been used to that rhetoric. So they've never really, and also the tariffs talks by President Trump, 50% tariffs on everything China sells to the US, just sounded at first, of course, sounded so outrageous that they, one of the interviews Bob and I did together was with former finance minister Lou Jiwei. He just basically called it like ridiculous if the US were to go ahead with this kind of threat, US wouldn't be entitled to be the world #1 anymore. So you just really, there is a sense of, in Beijing, they really underestimated not just Trump himself, but the overall shift in attitude and sentiment when it comes to China. So So after President Trump came to power, one of the first things the Chinese side did was inviting him over, right, for a very lavish so-called state visit plus. Basically showered this guy with attention, with very, grand gestures, this like emperor receiving another emperor from afar. So all that. So, Trump loved it. As we described in the book, he had really great time. But, he was surrounded, as Bob described, his advisors were mostly hawks when it comes to China. So they made him realize that, okay, that's nice, but this issue, the trade issue with China, that still need to be, addressed and resolved. So then the rest of we kind of documented very in greater detail in the book. So there was definitely some misreading, underestimation on the Chinese side of the US at the beginning. But as time goes on, the trade war intensifies, and the Chinese really started to realize, okay, now this time the American really meant it, right? In terms of the changes to the economy and all that. I remember one of my contacts, told me at the, in the midst of the trade war, and said, looks like, we can't bluff our way out this time. So,
Right.
so they did realize they're coming up against a very strong opponent, have very, much harsher China agenda. But again, there are some contradictions in China policy, in Chinese policy making as well. I mean, Xi Jinping himself, I still do believe he doesn't want to have confrontations with the United States. He still wants to have a stable relationship. However, he wants to sincerely, he really wants to be treated like an equal. He wants the respect. He really thinks China deserves the respect. So that really explains this kind of tit for tat techniques going, throughout this trade conflict. China, at least in public, they always, hit back the U.S. whenever the U.S. ramped up the tariffs. Of course, behind the scenes, the Chinese side still try to count on U.S. businesses to try to, send a message to American side. Both sides pull back a little bit, go back to the negotiating table. But then when it comes to really structural issues, right, the issues that matter the most to Lighthizer, but the issues also the hardest for China to carry out without hurting the party's interest, they haven't given up, much at all.
Yeah, absolutely. At this stage, I just want to remind everyone who's listening in that please feel free to use the Q&A button to ask questions, or the raise your hand function if you have any questions, and I'll ask those questions as we go along. In the meantime, Bob, one of the key factors, it seems to me here, is the sort of changing attitude of US businesses over time. Obviously, back in the late 90s, they were very vociferous in pushing for the opening up of China and for China to enter the WTO. And then, but that's gradually changed over time, and we see some of the trade bodies that are particularly active in China, attitudes shifting over time. Can you explain what happened there and what sort of USA Inc. is thinking now about the trade war?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. One, China wasn't the, what would you say, the sort of golden market that they thought it was. For some companies, obviously it has been, but it wasn't as easy as people thought. Chinese consumers didn't flock necessarily to the only American goods. Competition was tougher, and just regular complaints about theft of intellectual property, and even more than theft, kind of pressure, just pressure in any number of ways to hand over property, intellectual property, hand over their technological secrets, whether it was through a joint venture that was kind of in the beginning, but then it could be through regulatory bodies, through, gosh, there were so many different ways, these various panels that they had.
Expert panels, yeah.
Yes, all numbers of ways. And so that became an issue. And then I think it was kind of crystallized, there have been many reports over the years, but there was a report called Made in China 2025, where it laid out a plan for China to become the leading producer of a whole number of high technology sectors, where the feeling was on the part of US and European companies too, was that the only way they could do that was through continued pressure on them, and also through massive subsidies. So there was a lot of concern about China as competitor and China as unfair competitor. So that played in enormously into what they were thinking, and US companies behind the scenes filled in the US trade representative on the various practices that they found to be offensive, and laid the foundation for the US trade offensive, although they disagreed enormously with the tactics of ever increasing tariffs.
And one of the criticisms, I think, of the Trump administration, from outside at least, has been that, why didn't they try and bring on other countries into this push against China? I mean, a lot of European countries shared quite a lot of the criticisms of China and the way China was run. So why didn't the Trump administration reach out more, or was it just that they're just so sort of philosophically opposed to multilateralism? Is that why they didn't try and get more countries on side in this push?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of reasons. One, they are genuinely ideologically skeptical, shall we say, of multilateralism. They look at the U.S. as the predominant power in the world and think that the U.S. hasn't flexed its muscles as much as it possibly could. And then when you act unilaterally, you get tied up, in endless debates that the Europeans in particular, they would argue, will talk tough, but when it really comes to it, they're never going to really push hard on China. Same with Japan. European Union, is a Hydra-headed, institution. You need just unbelievable amounts of consensus to do anything. So there was that. I mean, that's a big part of it. And, as I say, there are a lot of unilateral tools that Lighthizer, the trade lawyer, knew and had been used over the years and had been put in abeyance, and he wanted to try it out. I mean, the French President Macron came to Washington for a state visit, I think it was April 2018, and talked to Trump and said, let's work together on this. And Trump said to him, I got this, literally said, I got this, we're good. And also remember, the U.S. had lots of complaints about the European Union, right? Lots of complaints about steel and any other number of issues.
I see. Meanwhile, Lingling, you said at the start there was some complacency in Beijing about the intentions of the Trump administration. What are they thinking now, though? Are the leadership in Beijing, are they ready for this to sort of become a kind of multi-year struggle? Or do they think that, the nature of US politics with the sort of 4-year cycles and the fact that, Trump might not even be president in a few months' time, means that they can just hold out and they can just promise more purchases of soybeans and that will just tide things over? What's the sort of prevailing feeling in Beijing, and what's the sort of long-term strategy that they have now?
Well, the trade war really is a wake-up call to Beijing that Washington is no longer a reliable partner. They would be lucky if things don't keep getting worse. So I think the best case scenario would be just maintaining status quo, right? There are conflicts and confrontations happening all over every part of the relationship, but still, you have this trade that holding the two nations together. So, wouldn't be like an outright gunfight or something like that. So the Chinese side, definitely Beijing has really stepped up investments in key areas, technology, especially technology-related industries. So they realized that, the reliance on U.S. technology was too much. I mean, made China very vulnerable. The Chinese companies very vulnerable. There's a passage in the book. We talked about various programs China has initiated during the trade war. One was the Anke project, aimed at purging SOEs and government agencies of US hardware and software. And there's another called Choke Point Initiative, which means the government basically helping companies. You don't have to be state-owned companies, private also, helping companies identify industries or areas that are that's particularly vulnerable to US sanctions. And then once those areas are identified, the government would give you funding to help you develop your own technology or think of other ways to source your parts or equipment. So you definitely see that, China is going down this more like, this route of trying to be more self-sufficient. And, but I do also still believe it's not in Beijing's interest, and they do realize that, not to see this relationship just keep getting worse. That's just not good for everyone. That explained also the recent meeting was between China's State Councilor Yang Jiechi, who's in charge, who oversees foreign policy, with Secretary of State Pompeo. Obviously, Chinese side made the overture to meet, but they also, just it's a meeting that aimed at at least maintaining status quo, explaining China's positions, for preventing the relationship from totally getting out of control. So they definitely,
Well, I was going to say, a lot of people, though, would say the problem is that if China sticks to its system, and in many ways, as you said before, under Xi Jinping, it seems to be doubling down on its economic model, that if China, though, doesn't sort of reform and change its economy, then that tension is going to remain and potentially get worse. So even though China doesn't want the relationship to get out of control, the risk is that it does if, China doesn't change in the way that the US and others want it to.
Right. Then the question is, if the trade war, if there's a really big takeaway lessons for US policymakers and others, is like, it's really hard to make China change now. The heavy-handed approach is not working. And as Bob said, one potential solution would be to work with allies, people like in Britain and Japan and other developed world, they do share some of the concerns the US has. Maybe, work together, go through the multilateral channels to really make the leadership realize it's in your interest to change. I guess that's really a little bit more realistic way than to deal with China as opposed to go it all alone. And another thing is, I hope another takeaway I hope people can have from reading this book is foreign pressure used to be good for reforms in China, not anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we are trying to be optimistic, and a question for both of you here, and by the way, once again, anyone listening who wants to ask a question, please do raise your hand, virtually at least. But a question for both of you. I mean, if you're just trying to be a little bit optimistic here, is there room for compromise here? I mean, there are areas of the Chinese economy, for example, that if they opened up a bit more would be good for China, it would be good for the Chinese economy, it would be good for foreign investors as well. Is there still a recognition of that on both sides, or is there a danger that things have got a souring too much for that to be appreciated?
I would say from the Washington perspective, trying to be optimistic. So let's take it, with both administrations. So a second Trump term, the optimistic scenario would be that they do actually start a round two, phase two of negotiations, and that China is sincerely interested in changing some of its policies, because the reformers have made the argument, and it is persuasive to Xi Jinping that it is in the interest of the party and to boost the economy, and only reform will boost the economy. I'm not saying I think that'll happen, but that would be the optimistic case. All that would still be the same if Biden wins. I think the other change in Biden would certainly be a change in tone. It would certainly be an effort to operate more multilaterally and look for different ways to pressure China. I think China, my guess is that China, Lingling can let me know if this is right, might make some overtures, trying to make things a little better too. But the reality also is that Biden would inherit a world where 3/4 of what's sent from China to the U.S. is under significant tariffs, and he's not just going to let that go for nothing. I mean,
Right.
there's too much political pressure on him not to do that.
Absolutely. Lingling, your thoughts there? Any room for optimism here?
Well, it's really hard to be optimistic these days, but so I just, you know, obviously all of the problems, a lot of the problems the U.S. side identified, you know, industrial subsidies, SOE reforms, and all those harder reforms, you know, could really benefit China in the long run, China's economy. But it really also, you know, runs up against Xi Jinping's own overarching, you know, policy agenda, which is, you know, really strengthening the party's role in China. So I really don't think the room for bigger ban kind of reforms is that big. China still talks about reform today.
Yeah.
And just recently, they announced a big plan to turn the southern island of Hainan, the Hainan province, into basically a free duty-free port, right? That, you know, on the surface, it was a great plan, right? That just, you know, another big step in liberalization. However, if you read the fine print, you know, they're still talking about, you know, basically industrial policy. There's still industrial policy component, talked about directing funds into key industries, and mostly technology-related industries. And you still don't know, in the time frame for this whole plan is also quite long. I don't think they're talking about in any time soon, like this year or next year. They're talking about 2025 or something like that. So, you know, it's a lot of policies, you know, in China. It started really, you know, very ambitious and, you know, at the first glance, it's really great. But it all comes down to implementation, and sometimes it just, you know, never gets implemented, or implemented in a way that just all about strengthening the existing model as opposed to real reform. So it's a really, well, if China is not going to change, then the question is, you know, what the US and other developed nations that share the concerns with yours would do, and how, you know, Chinese market is still so huge, the biggest in the world. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the desire to keep accessing the Chinese market, Chinese consumers, against some of the values of the democratic nations? How do you deal with that?
Well, that's something that's obviously come to the forefront of discussion in the UK in the last few weeks. Bob, I wondered what's happening with popular opinion in the US. I mean, I think back to the actual Cold War with Russia, and I was growing up in the 80s as a kid, and you really obviously had a sense of Russia as the baddie, it's the enemy, they've got nuclear weapons pointed at us, and they have a horrible system that we don't understand. The reality with China is somewhat different, isn't it? We know quite a lot about China. There's not that sort of threat of war, at least at the moment. What do Americans on the ground sort of feel about the trade war? Is it popular? Is it something they're prepared for? Or is it something that they're starting to feel in terms of higher prices for goods because of tariffs? Is it something that's starting to cause economic pain?
Well, I mean, I think it causes economic pain for some of the companies that are hit by tariffs. But there's so much going on in the US at this point. I mean, you know, the pandemic kind of overwhelms everything. So people are out of work for nothing that, you know, I mean, you can argue that China screwed up its response to COVID and all that, but you know, the pandemic overwhelms, the impact of the pandemic on the economy overwhelms everything else. But I think what one of the impacts of the trade war has been to deepen the animosity that ordinary Americans feel toward China. According to polls taken by the Pew Institute, China's never, the negative feelings toward China have never been as low, at least since the early 1990s. I'm not sure it's back to, Red China, as it used to be called. But it's moving, unfortunately, in my view anyway, moving in that direction where China is overtaking Russia as kind of enemy number one.
Yeah, but that, I guess, again, back in the Russia Cold War, that was a decades long struggle between two economic systems, essentially. And it was something that, we in the West were sort of bought into for the long term. And I wonder just, clearly if there's going to be long-term pressure on China to change somehow towards a more Western style model, again, it's going to take years and years and decades for that to happen. I just wonder if people in America are prepared psychologically for that, or even signed up to that kind of struggle.
No, I mean, they haven't been prepared for that sort of struggle. That is one of the weaknesses of the Trump approach, was not to try to get buy-in, to talk about sacrifices that might be necessary to make because of the challenge from China. That was something that American president after American president, talked about when it came to Russia. Also, organizing American industry, or helping American industry and academia to stay ahead on the technologies of the future that we're so worried about China leapfrogging us on. With Russia, there was an enormous amount of spending on R&D, motivated, but a lot of it by fear of the first Russian satellite called Sputnik, fear of Russian missiles. You don't see the Trump administration talking in that way, but we may be on the precipice, probably are, frankly, on the precipice of a decades-long struggle. Hopefully, it won't be in the same way it was with the Soviet Union, where the imminent concern about the world being obliterated in a nuclear war, isn't, first and foremost on people's minds, but it's more a trade and technological struggle, and ideological as well.
Yeah. I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been absolutely fantastic to have both of you. I've read the book. It's absolutely fantastic. Everyone should get a copy, Superpower Showdown. It's been lovely to catch up with you, in particular Lingling, who I worked with for many years. So thank you once again, both of you, for making the time.
Thank you so much.
It's been absolutely fascinating. I'll hand you back to Lisa at this stage, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Lingling. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Andrew. Really, really interesting, and so much for us to think about. We are a cliche, a connected world, so there's a lot there. Before we close the session, I do just want to do a quick ad for some upcoming webinars. This is our new normal. We've got a lot of digital going on at the moment. We've got a UK visas and immigration briefing tomorrow. Charlotte Day, who's Regional Director of Asia Pacific in Visas and Immigration, so that should be really interesting. Next Tuesday, we've got an event with ASI, Aberdeen Standard Investments, in the City of London around China's ESG evolution. We've got a couple more premium webinars coming up. We're actually going back into the US, if you like, the US-China relations, with Craig Allen, who's President of US-China Business Council. Some of you will already have been to a meeting, physical meeting with him. And we've also got the Bloomberg Chief Economist Tom Orlick speaking about China, the bubble that never popped. We'll leave you on that note. Thank you so much again. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Lingling and Bob. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much, please, Andrew. Okay.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.